I'm Tyler Morrison. And when my older brother laughed at me in my mom's living room, that was it. I snapped. He wasn't just kidding around, he was making a total fool out of me. Still don't have a job? Must be nice doing nothing all day. He said it loud so everyone could hear. His buddies all started laughing, cheering with their drinks like my failure was some big victory. They thought I had no job. They figured I had no drive, no power. What they didn't know was that every last one of them worked for me. I'm not kidding. I mean literally. My brother had no clue that the startup he was always bragging about, the one he said he practically ran himself, was only there because I built it, from the ground up. One choice at a time, one screw up at a time. I did it years before any of them even showed up. So I just stood there acting like it didn't bother me, like their jokes weren't getting worse every time. I kept who I was a secret for reasons they'd never get. I'll get to that later. But that night, hearing them all laugh, something just changed in me. While they were having fun, ripping me apart, I knew something that was going to wreck their whole world by morning. I didn't yell. I didn't fight back. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, put my drink down, and walked out. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Before I tell you what went down the second I closed that door and how I turned their world upside down, tell me something. What time is it for you? And where are you watching this from? I'm curious to see how far this story gets. Growing up, I figured out our house had a scoreboard. You couldn't see it, but it was there. My older brother, Brandon Morrison, was always winning without even trying. I was just on the sidelines. I kept my own score quietly. Our mom, Patricia, she never said she had a favorite, but her face lit up for every little thing he did. That told me everything. Brandon made a sports team and his picture went right on the fridge. I won a coding competition. And she just smiled, said, "That's nice," and went back to her chores. He was the golden boy. Everyone just expected him to be a big shot. I was the smart one. In our family, that felt more like a second-place trophy than a compliment. By my early 20s, I knew I wasn't going to get any approval at home, so I got my degree, got a job at a little software company, and spent all my nights working on this idea I couldn't shake. It was a platform that I knew could help businesses track their work so they wouldn't get buried in spreadsheets. Seattle seemed like the right move. It's a big tech city, but not so big that a new company would get lost. I rented a little desk in a shared office, figured out how to sell my idea without freaking out, and started getting real work. After a while, I hired an engineer to help out, and we moved into our own office in a glass tower downtown. Right from the start, I made sure my name wasn't on anything. The company was registered under a different name through lawyers and an agent. Not me. I've seen how people jump on board the second they smell success trying to take credit. I just wanted the freedom to build my company without every relative suddenly needing something. Meanwhile, Brandon was just bouncing between sales jobs he couldn't hold down. He'd call me all frustrated, blaming some bad boss or a sales quota that was impossible to hit. Then a few months later, he'd mention some company restructure that surprise got him laid off. Our mom worried about him all the time. She treated his problems like a hurricane we all had to protect him from. So when she found out my company was a success, she wasn't proud of me. Her first thought was a question. Could I find a spot for Brandon, a job and interview? Just a way to get his foot in the door. She tried to make it sound like a favor, but it felt like an order, like something I owed him. I thought about it way longer than I should have. I made a promise to myself to never, ever mix family and business. But then I remembered Brandon driving me to my finals when my old car died on me, or the times he stood up for me when I was getting picked on in school. So in the end, I asked my head of operations to talk to a recruiter we trusted. I kept it simple. I said we had an opening in sales. And I told her I knew a guy who might be a good fit. I never said he was my brother. There were no special favors. I wanted to see if he could do it on his own. He actually did great in the interview. The feedback was good, and he took the job right away. For a little while, it felt kind of good. He'd go on about this new startup he was working for, and he had no idea he was talking about my company. I stayed out of sight at the office. I was the founder on paper, and I showed up for the big meetings. But on a normal day, my team dealt with senior staff, not me. Brandon worked for a director, just another face in the company. I watched from a distance as he learned everything and joked around with his team. And he even hit his first few targets. But then the red flags started. Little things. A comment in a review about how he always talked over people. A note from HR about a complaint. It wasn't formal, but it was there. One of my managers casually mentioned that Brandon had a lot of energy, but not always in a good way. I read every single word, and I could feel that same old story starting all over again. By the end of the first quarter, I knew something was wrong on Brandon's team. It was this pressure you can't measure, but you can hear it in people's voices. I heard it in comments from managers, in the awkward silences when his name came up, and how the new hires would disappear when he was near the break room. I couldn't look the other way, even though I really wanted to. I started watching more. I'd listen from the hallways or join meetings with my camera off so no one knew I was there. It wasn't what they were saying in the meetings that got to me. It was the feeling in the room. Whenever Brandon started talking, he took over. He'd cut people off and act like his ideas were the only ones that mattered, leaving no room for anyone else. If someone did try to push back even a little, he'd make a joke to make them feel stupid for even trying. But the moment it all blew up, that came from someone who didn't even work there anymore. I got a message from a former employee. She said she needed to talk. Her name was Emma Richardson. She was one of the first people we hired. I remembered seeing her name on a goodbye email about 6 months back with some vague line about finding new opportunities. I didn't think much of it then. People come and go, but when she asked to talk in person, my gut just tightened. We met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the office. She looked different than the bright, eager person I remembered. More cautious, like she was second-guessing every move. When she finally spoke, the words came out shaky at first. Then they just started pouring out like she'd been holding them in for way too long. She told me how things changed after Brandon got there, how he turned team meetings into his personal comedy hour, how the smallest mistakes became ammo, how certain people, her included, became the butt of his harmless jokes. But they never felt harmless. She didn't cry. She wasn't being dramatic. She just laid out the facts, the comments. The way she was excluded, the humiliation he passed off as team bonding. She told me she tried going to HR, but the complaint didn't go anywhere because she didn't make it official. She didn't want to be labeled sensitive in an industry that punishes you for that. Listening to her, I felt this slow, heavy anger building in my chest. It wasn't the usual flash of frustration I'd get with Brandon. This was a quieter, colder anger that made every detail hit harder. It wasn't just that he was a jerk. It was that he created a place where good people like Emma felt so cornered they had to quit a job they were great at. When she finished, she actually apologized, like telling me the truth was a problem for me. I told her it wasn't. I thanked her for trusting me, but I didn't say why her words were so important. She had no idea who I really was in that company, and I didn't tell her. This wasn't about my job title. This was about a responsibility I now knew I had. After she left, I just sat there for a long time, blowing off appointments I didn't even care to reschedule. The weight of her story wasn't optional anymore. It felt like a line had been drawn in the sand, one I couldn't pretend I didn't see. The next morning, back at the office, I asked for every single HR document related to Brandon's team. I read every line looking for patterns that backed up Emma's story. There were little notes, carefully worded phrases enough to show people weren't happy, but not enough to trigger a real investigation. I went over meeting recordings and old chat logs, seeing all the interactions in a whole new light. There was no big smoking gun, just a steady stream of bad behavior that painted a very clear picture. I wasn't looking for a scapegoat. I wanted clarity. To get it, I met with Rachel Stevens, my chief operating officer. She's the only one who knows I'm the founder. I laid out everything I'd learned. I didn't use Emma's name until the very end, trying to protect her. Rachel listened, and her face got that tight look it gets when something is dead serious. She didn't rush to find an easy fix. Instead, she asked sharp questions that forced me to say out loud what I was really afraid of. That our company culture was turning into something I never ever wanted to build. By the time we were done, I knew what I had to do. The next steps weren't going to be easy or fast. But doing nothing meant letting the company turn into something I wouldn't even recognize. And I wasn't about to just stand by and watch. The day I went after the truth in my own company, it all started out quiet, like the building had no idea what was coming. I walked through the lobby, like I always did, just another face in the crowd, slipping past all the chatter and keyboards. I wasn't hiding. I was listening, trying to hear what was really going on underneath all the noise. I'd told our recruiter to add one more candidate to the mid-morning interview schedule. That candidate was me, and nobody in that department had a clue. I just said it was for an internal audit, and I kept the details fuzzy on purpose. People don't ask questions when something sounds official on their calendar. My interview was with a few people from the sales team. I knew their names from the complaints I'd been digging into. I was done with reports. I had to see this for myself. I tied my hair back, put on some plain clothes, and used my middle name, Elelina, to sign in. The interview room felt smaller than I remembered. It's a room designed to see if you'll crack under pressure. I took a deep breath. I wasn't worried about their questions, but how they were going to ask them. They walked in talking to each other, all casual and relaxed. Not one of them even looked at me as they sat down. They went from talking about their weekend to making fun of the last applicant. They weren't loud, but their tone had a bite to it. They laughed like people do when they're sure they have all the power. When they finally turned to me, everything changed. The questions came fast, one after another. They weren't trying to get to know me, they were trying to trip me up. Every time I answered, they'd glance at each other like they were sharing a private joke. They weren't curious. They were entertained. I kept my answers calm and careful, trying not to show I knew exactly what they were doing. They cut me off a lot, not in a mean way, but with that slick confidence of people who think pausing makes you weak. None of them gave a damn about my skills. They wanted a show, the kind that made them feel big and important. At one point, one guy got a text. He looked at his phone, smirked, and showed the screen to the person next to him. Then came a little laugh. I didn't need to know what it said. Their reaction told me everything I needed to know. Respect wasn't part of their game. The whole time I was just making a mental list, taking in every detail, a skill I learned long before I started this company. Their body language, the looks they shared, the way they dismissed me. It all painted a much clearer picture than any HR report ever could. When they were done, I barely got a thank you. I stood up, nodded, and walked out into the hall, pretending to be calm. The door clicked shut behind me, and right then I knew exactly what I had to do. I walked to the elevator and pushed the button for the top floor. As it went up, I could feel my breathing even out. Any doubt I had left was gone the second the doors opened to my office. Inside, the whole city was laid out before me. But all I could focus on was that folder on my desk, all the proof I'd gathered for days. It wasn't one big smoking gun, it was a pattern. And patterns are what tell the truth in a company. A few minutes later, Rachel Stevens, my COO, came in. I'd asked to meet her privately before the big afternoon meeting. She closed the door gently behind her. That one small thing told me more than words could. I laid out what I saw in the interview, and then I showed her the proof I'd found. Little warning notes, weird things in the meeting recordings, quiet comments from managers trying not to make waves. Rachel listened hard, and I saw her face get that sharp look it gets when something's really wrong. I told her I needed a full leadership meeting in an hour. No delays. No rescheduling. She just nodded. She knew how serious this was and where I was taking it. As she handled the details, I imagined the team downstairs going back to their desks with no idea what was about to hit them. They thought what happened in that interview room stayed in that room. They were about to get a rude awakening. The leadership meeting started in the afternoon after everyone had settled into the conference room with their laptops. They all had on their fake confident faces, acting like they knew who ran this place. I sat at the head of the long table. The old leather chair felt different, more solid than I expected. Today wasn't just business as usual. This was a tipping point. Across from me sat David Patterson. He's the head of sales and the most senior person from that interview panel I'd been watching. This was the first time I'd seen him up close since the quiet complaints started hitting my inbox months ago. He sat up perfectly straight, his face a total mask like he thought being disciplined could hide everything that was coming apart. I waited for the room to get quiet before I said anything. I didn't need to raise my voice. When you know you're right, you don't have to yell. I started the meeting with some simple questions. Questions about our culture, how we hire, and if we're doing things the same way across the board. I asked every leader to tell me off the top of their head how their teams judge a candidate. Most of them gave the usual corporate answers about being professional and fair words from a handbook, not real life. David's answer was slick, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He talked about high standards, about pushing for the best wanting candidates who could handle pressure. He never once mentioned how his team twisted that into something else. Something meant to break people down, not build them up. I let him finish his whole speech even when he refused to look me in the eye. After everyone had their turn, I told them about the internal audit I'd been running. I gave them the data first, before any of the drama. I pointed out the really high number of people who dropped out after being sent by certain recruiters. The crazy amount of bad feedback all pointing to one interview team, and all the follow-ups that got ignored that I had saved in a special folder. The whole mood in the room changed. You could tell everyone knew what this was about. Then I started talking about an interview I saw that morning. I didn't say I was the one they interviewed, and I didn't use any names. I just talked about the behavior, the dismissive way they spoke, cutting the person off for no reason, the unprofessional side comments. A few people tensed up. Others tried to look like they didn't care. David's jaw just clenched. It was a small thing, but you couldn't miss it. I kept my voice calm. I really wanted to let my frustration show, but I held it back. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Being direct would. I told them I wasn't looking for apologies or excuses. I wanted to know why this kind of behavior was allowed to happen and why respect was missing from a process that's supposed to build our company. The table went dead silent. It wasn't an angry silence, you could just feel the gears turning in everyone's head. I watched each of them try to figure out what this meant for them. Some looked nervous. Some looked almost relieved, like they'd been waiting for someone to finally call it out. But David's face just got colder, like I was just wasting his time instead of fixing a real problem. I asked him straight up when he'd last reviewed his team's interview tapes. He answered fast, a little too fast. Said he reviewed them all the time. But you could hear that little bit of doubt in his voice that gave him away. I didn't push it. The proof I had saved on my drive would speak for itself soon enough. I just moved the meeting along and laid out the new changes effective immediately. Mandatory reviews for all in-interview panels and anonymous surveys from candidates that would come directly to my office. And any team that got flagged 2 times in 1 quarter would be put under direct supervision. I also said every manager now has to sit in on at least 2 interviews outside their own department to get some perspective and see their own blind spots. These weren't punishments, they were structural fixes. They were meant to fix a culture that had completely lost its way. As the meeting went on, the tension just got thicker. Some managers asked careful questions. Others were just writing down every single word I said. David stayed quiet, but his silence was more intense than any argument. He knew exactly what these changes meant. This supervision wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. And mirrors don't lie, especially when you've been avoiding your own reflection for a long time. When the meeting finally ended, chairs scraped back, laptops snapped shut, and people filed out with a lot on their minds they weren't saying out loud. I stayed in my seat until the room was empty, just letting the quiet settle in. This wasn't the big fight I knew was coming. This was just the first step. It had to be done. It was planned, and there was no stopping it. The office got quieter as the afternoon dragged on. There were long stretches of silence, broken only by footsteps in the hall. I used that quiet to get back to the files I'd been building up on my private system. Every report made the picture of the problem clearer. These were patterns you wouldn't notice at first, but when you saw them all together, you couldn't ignore them. A new folder caught my eye, labeled with a name I hadn't dealt with yet. Kevin Mitchell, the head of operations. Employees talked about him, but never directly. It was always hints. He wasn't the type to start a fight. He just let things happen. His way of leading just let people cross lines they never should have. I had to know just how far he'd let things slide. While I was reading, a notification popped up. Kevin wanted a meeting. The timing felt planned. It was almost a slap in the face coming right after that leadership talk. I accepted. I was curious to see what he'd say without meaning to. When he showed up, he acted all calm, but it felt totally fake. The kind of calm you have to practice, not the kind you actually feel. I told him to sit, keeping my voice flat while I focused. He started with a bunch of excuses talking about communication gaps and how work was spread out, and all the pressure his team was under. He made it all sound like someone else's problem. Like all these issues just popped up out of thin air. The vagueness was on purpose. It was his way of talking a lot without saying anything. I just listened, I didn't say a word. I watched him dodge the details every single time. He talked about worries he'd supposedly had for months. But there wasn't a single thing in the files that showed he'd done anything about them. He was just trying to distance himself from the mess his department had become. Then he switched to warning me about moving too fast, telling me not to make any big changes. That's when I saw right through him. He wasn't protecting the company. He was protecting the easy life he'd made for himself by looking the other way. He left acting all confident, but as soon as he was out the door, it felt like the room could finally breathe. I finally got his role. He wasn't some villain, just a weak spot in the foundation nobody ever noticed. After he left, I opened a different folder. It had my brother's name on it. Brandon's reports were harder to get through, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. I recognized the little put-downs he made to employees, all written down in anonymous notes. I recognized the pattern of him slacking off and covering it with a joke. His terrible leadership wasn't new to me. It was the same way he'd treated me at family get-togethers for years. He brought that same attitude to the office. He just assumed the company would put up with it like our parents did. The only difference now was that his actions had real consequences here. Every review, every recording, every note. It all built a case that couldn't be excused. Being family wasn't going to save him. The truth wasn't going to bend for him. Not anymore. Outside, the sun was setting. It left these faded streaks of color across the city. I turned back to my calendar, planning the next steps. Audits for the rest of the week. Follow-up meetings with the team leads, and a full review of the company structure. We couldn't put it off any longer. This wasn't about getting revenge, it had to be done. By the time I turned off my computer, the office was almost empty. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the moment right before an earthquake. Something was moving under the surface, slow but steady. Tomorrow, it was all going to come to a head. The people who thought they were safe were about to find out they were wrong. The next morning, I was crystal clear on what I had to do. There was no more room for doubt. I got to the office before most people had even grabbed their coffee, knowing that what I did today would change the company and my family for good. I had all the proof. The pattern was clear. It was time to make my move. I called the first meeting with the executive team. I made sure every single department head was there. The room filled up slow, but the tension was already thick. People can always feel when something big is about to drop. I sat down and opened the folder with the final reports. It wasn't a threat. It was proof. I started with Kevin Mitchell, the director of operations. This was the first time he'd hear it straight from me. I laid out all his failures, the huge problems he'd ignored for years, and the damage his lazy leadership did to our hiring. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. The facts alone were enough to crush him. When I told him he was fired effective immediately, the room went dead silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy. His face tensed up, but he didn't look surprised. He looked like he knew it was coming. He just stood up, nodded like a robot, and walked out without a fight. Some people just crumble. Others just get out of the way when it's time to pay the price. Next, I turned to the team from that interview I saw. What they did wasn't a one-time thing. It was a bad habit, and their bosses let it happen. I fired every one of them for unprofessional conduct and for breaking company rules over and over. A couple tried to argue, some just stared down at the table, but none of them dared to pretend they didn't know what they did was wrong. Being held accountable always feels worse for the people who thought they were untouchable. Then it was time for the last name, the one that had been on my mind more than any other, Brandon. My brother walked in after the leadership team had left, having no clue what just went down. The door clicked shut behind him. The room suddenly felt really small. I looked at him not as my brother, but as an employee who screwed up with proof to back it up. I told him about the reports, the bad performance reviews, the complaints, the recordings. He tried to make a joke at first, like he could laugh it all away. But you can't joke your way out of hard evidence. When I told him he was fired, the shock just cracked right across his face. He asked if our parents knew. I said they didn't need to. This was a business decision. This wasn't a family talk in the living room. He just stared at me in total disbelief, but with something else there too. He was finally realizing that being family couldn't save him anymore. He left without slamming the door. For some reason, that quiet exit felt a lot heavier than if he'd screamed at me. After the meetings, a new kind of silence fell over the office. It was the quiet of a storm that had already passed, not one that was coming. I walked the halls and just took in the stillness. It felt like we'd finally dealt with something that was ignored for way too long. In the days after, the company got it together faster than I expected. With new people watching, interviews got a lot fairer. People started giving real, honest feedback, and the whole vibe began to get more stable. When everyone's held accountable, it becomes a foundation, not something to be scared of. My family, on the other hand, took it very differently. The news that Brandon was fired got to my parents faster than I thought. Their disappointment hit me that same old, heavy feeling. But it didn't cut as deep as it used to. They kept saying I should have protected him. But covering for someone isn't love. It's just giving them a pass to keep hurting other people. I didn't argue. You can't explain some truths. People have to learn them from a distance. So we grew apart. Weeks later, I was sitting in my office looking out over the city, and I had a quiet realization. Endings don't always show up with a big bang. Sometimes they're just things becoming clear, a boundary you finally draw a life that stops bending for what breaks it. For me, this story wasn't about getting even. It was about being responsible for myself, for the people I was in charge of, and for the future I was building with no apologies. And for all of you who stuck with me to the end, thank you. I hope you'll share what this story made you feel. What part of it felt familiar, or what you're taking away from it. I'd love to hear how far this story reached and what it meant to you.